Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Sarabia, and I'm here to talk to you more today about unlocking Azure cloud services with Azure VMware Solution. So with that, let's get right into it. There's a few things we want to cover today, and here's the agenda. We'll start out with an overview about Azure services. We want to take a look at Azure Networking with AVS, and while we have another session dedicated to a more in-depth look, we want to cover Azure Networking from the perspective of the things you need to think about if you're going to integrate with Azure services. As part of that story, I want to tell you more about how you can obtain and establish secure and private access to Azure services to extend the workloads in your AVS private cloud. And then we'll walk through a few use cases at the end. All right, so let's start off with our Azure service overview. Firstly, I'd like to talk more about how we think in terms of modernizing workloads with Azure services for these workloads that you already have in AVS. We see this as a multi-step process. And it really starts with this idea of migrating and extending workloads from on-premises. This could be using tools like HCX, for example. And really, for the purposes of our discussion today, we're really going to pick up the later part of the story where we think you've already migrated some workloads, and really you're trying to take these next steps that we show on the slide here. So the next step we see is modernizing workloads by attaching services, what we're here to talk about today, and we'll look through some of those examples hands-on. You can save costs by right-sizing your AVS environment, your private cloud, and by gaining operational efficiency through the use of Azure services. And ultimately, this results in freeing up resources so that you can focus your organization on higher value tasks and innovation for your business. So continuing this thought, this is looking more in depth than what we were just talking about, is we think there's a way to simplify digital transformation with a migration-ready cloud. And AVS is that migration-ready cloud today. There's a sequence you want to follow typically. So if you're coming to AVS, let's say you're in the process or even just thinking about it today, we start off with planning migration. It could be that not every workload that you have on-premise is suitable for migration to AVS. So you want to figure out the things that will come over. This could be because there are systems you would like to retire, for example, and it doesn't really make sense for you to migrate to AVS. So that's phase one. Once you have a good migration plan, we always recommend that as the starting point, you can provision AVS. This is setting up an AVS solution, or rather Azure VMware Solution private cloud. We showed an example of that in the keynote. It's a pretty straightforward thing to do. Next, you want to connect to AVS, and you want to get your AVS environment connected to your on-premises network and or data center. And there's another session that we have that you can dive more deeply into that workflow. We'll cover it at a high level here later on. Once you have all of that plumbing, then you can migrate your workloads, as I mentioned earlier, with a tool like VMware HCX that very much simplifies migration from on-premise into an AVS private cloud. And that's really, we see those first four steps as being the rehosting part of this process. And it's setting the stage for digital transformation. And then we go to what we consider to be the actual modernization bucket, where we are attaching Azure services and enabling us to modernize workloads in a way that we couldn't before, and doing so securely and privately, which we'll continue to explore throughout this presentation. Okay, so let's dive into a little bit more detail. So on this slide, what I'm showing is AVS integration with the Azure ecosystem. And by Azure ecosystem, I really mean there's a wide, vast collection of services that you can use. And you can use them in different ways to modernize your environment. So sometimes modernization is not just about your workloads, like the VMs that are running inside of AVS. It can also be things that integrate more at your private cloud layer. And so in this view, what I'm looking at more is these services that connect at the private cloud layer or at the Azure platform layer, but they can help you modernize your operations. And there's a lot of different buckets. So I'm not going to read all of these here. You can take a look at them yourself. But what I want to highlight is the numerous categories of offerings that we have that provide this sort of integration. So it's one way to think about it. So you can take advantage of, rather, an existing Azure service to enable you to improve your operations. So we'll look at like the monitoring bucket as an example of that. There are services in Azure already, like Log Analytics and like Monitor. And so if you wish, you can use these services part of an integration with your AVS private cloud. Now, the other thing to think about is modernization of AVS workloads, leveraging native Azure services from within the workloads themselves. What I mean by this is these are VMs that are running in your AVS private cloud, and there may be things that we want to do inside of those workloads to leverage services. And that could be different than some of these surrounding ones that we were just talking about a few minutes ago, or it could be similar in some cases. And there's a few buckets that you can see down below that we're showing. And I want to dig into a little bit more detail here because there is a big collection of things that you can use, nearly 50 services that you might use to migrate, or rather to modernize your AVS workload. And so we want to dig into more detail. Now, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to get into all of them. So we'll highlight just a few of those here today. So this is taking those buckets at the bottom that we just looked at, those categories, things like AI and ML and analytics and database and compute, and just expanding out so you can see some of the services that fit into those categories. So you might have a workload, for example, where you wish to do something like a database expansion, and you would like to do that expansion using a managed PaaS service for database. Here's an example of some services that you can use to accomplish that. We have many customers that will do things with their applications where they might have part of an application running inside of AVS for a reason on an AVS VM, and they might have other parts of the application running out in compute in Azure virtual machines. It's a common pattern that we see with customers using network virtualization appliances or firewalls inside of Azure, and that's something that you can learn more about in the end-to-end networking session. Or it could be some other application component that for whatever reason makes sense to run on an Azure VM. Of course, we are at Microsoft the Copilot company, so I can't talk to you today without mentioning AI and ML. And you can integrate things like Azure Machine Learning into your workloads, and we're going to look at that in more detail later on in the presentation. Here are a few more examples. We see storage as a pretty common option. There's a few things you can do with security both at the private cloud layer and within the workload itself. And there's some others as well. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get into all of them, like I said, but these are the other items: integration, IoT, management, and governance. Really, we're going to focus on those first 7 or 8 for the rest of our discussion today. But I want to be sure that you're aware that there are these other categories available to you if they make sense for your workload. So coming back to this view, what I've done at the bottom here is we have some workloads that now, instead of showing the individual groupings of services, we've provided some sample service names here. And so these are things that we see customers using today or expressing interest in that you can integrate directly into a workload that's running inside of AVS. Okay, with that, I would like to move on into this next session to talk a little bit more about networking with AVS. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is really from the perspective of what you need to think about when you're doing this type of integration with native services inside of Azure. Now, before we get too far, I do want to emphasize this point, and it's something that we touched on earlier. It is an and, not an or, when we're talking about a solution integration strategy. And what I mean by that is, if we look at the middle of the screen here, this represents your AVS private cloud. And as we were talking about previously, you have a lot of options in how you might do some sort of integration with your workloads. So on one hand of the slide where it says support core services, and there's examples like ExpressRoute and Gateway, these are some more specific examples of a service that you can use that's more at the private cloud layer. And then the right-hand side, we have some other services that are focused more on modernizing application infrastructure. And these are some similar examples to what we were just looking at on some of our previous slides. So what I want to emphasize here is you don't have to choose one or the other of these. It could be that some of these core services make sense for you to adopt as part of your integration strategy, in addition to the application infrastructure components that will allow you to modernize those applications. Really, for the rest of the talk today, we're going to focus more on the modernized application infrastructure and what it looks like to start integrating some of these Azure services into your AVS workloads. So here we have some common integration options, and I've touched on these a little bit before, but I do want to emphasize here that these are some common things that we see our customers either doing today or asking us a lot about. The first two are storage related, so blob storage and Azure Files. These give you some options for low cost and high performance, storage. And it depends what your use case is. So it could be the case that blob storage makes sense for what you're trying to do, potentially archival, like is one example. And Azure Files is a common use case we see for customers who are looking to adopt a more cloudified version of, say, file shares, such as NFS and SMB. So it provides under the same storage account the ability for you to leverage that type of environment, but instead of, say, operating a file server, you can have those files hosted in Azure itself. So we see that pretty common from our customers coming over into an AVS environment. On the right-hand side, we have some additional options that we're showing here. I mentioned previously the idea of a database expansion. So this is the idea of Azure SQL Managed Instance, where customers say, hey, great, I've got things in AVS now, what next? I want to leverage some more modern technologies or PaaS-based services. So Azure SQL MI is one of those options that is of interest to customers and that we see them exploring. And as mentioned previously, we need to talk about AI services. We're going to take a look at some of these a little bit later on, but these two are options for you when you're running your workloads in AVS to integrate between your AVS environment and Azure. Okay, so let's talk about networking a little bit. One of the big advantages that you get when you migrate to Azure VMware Solution is now you're sitting inside of the same data centers and physical locations that the rest of Azure is. This gives you an opportunity to have a high throughput, low latent connection from your AVS environment to the rest of Azure, something that's simply not doable if you leave your VMware environment on-premise in your data center today. So this is where we see a lot of excitement from customers because it really unlocks these opportunities to combine these things together. So how you do that specifically, if we start on the right-hand side, there's the Azure VMware Solution private cloud environment. And every AVS environment comes with an express route that we manage. It's part of the solution. And that is how you connect into the rest of Azure so that you can take advantage of some of these services that we're describing. Now, you may not take advantage of these services. You'll always have an express route, and that is essentially how you route traffic into and out of your AVS environment. But what it means is when I have an express route that's connected into a virtual network that I need to establish connectivity, again, a point that we get into more detail in the end-to-end networking session. When I'm inside of that virtual network and AVS is attached to it, it opens up some possibilities for us that we're really here to emphasize today. There's a couple things that we want to talk about. One is subnet delegation and integration inside of a VNet. It's a short name of a virtual network. And this allows you to facilitate communication from that VNet to these services in particular ways. And by extension, when we have Azure VMware Solution wired into the VNet from our express route via an express route gateway, then it facilitates communication between Azure VMware Solution and the workloads running inside of it and these services that are attached to the VNet. A really specific pattern that we're here to discuss and explore with you today is something called a private endpoint. And we're going to get into more detail about this in just a few minutes. But the key thing is this allows you to communicate with some of these Azure services that we've just been describing in a private manner, using a private IP address. So that connectivity from Azure VMware Solution and its workloads occurs in a private and secure manner without a need to traverse the internet or a public endpoint. Of course, this gets very important, right? If you're working with your data and you want insights from your data, you also want to do that in a secure fashion. And that's really what private endpoint facilitates. Ultimately, the story here is that you have a high bandwidth, low latency connection to Azure from AVS and its workloads to really innovate using Azure services. All right, with that, I would like to take us to our first demo. So in this demo, we're going to take a look at some of the Azure Networking Foundation topics that we just discussed. And I want you to see what this looks like actually in the Azure portal once we've done this initial setup. And then we'll spend some time talking more about how we can do some of the stuff that we saw on earlier slides. All right, with that, let's go ahead and switch over to the Azure portal. And there's a few places we need to look to get a sense of what we were just talking about and what that looks like if you're inside of the Azure portal. So I'm going to scroll down here to some of my resources. And here I have an AVS private cloud. And to save us some time, I've done some pre-configuration in advance. So a lot of these things are configured already. We just don't have enough time to do all of that in this demo. So I'll walk you through some of the steps you might take and how it looks once you finish the configuration and how you know you've done it the right way. All right, so first, this is an overview of an AVS private cloud. We have some information here. The thing that we're really interested in looking at for our purposes in this demo is the connectivity section. So if I scroll down to the Manage section on the left-hand side and click on Connectivity, this is where you can see a summary of some of the connectivity options that have been configured for your AVS private cloud. As I was mentioning earlier, when we provision an AVS private cloud for the first time, you will get an express route circuit. And this is that link. Remember that in that diagram where it was showing the traffic flowing out of AVS and into Azure? This is that express route link. So it's something that we manage for you. And here you have an interface basically to make connections to it. And that's really what you see down below here under name. This is an authorization key. We'll talk about that in just a couple more minutes. But this is how I can see that, one, there's this express route managed, kind of my way to get into the rest of Azure, and where I can see some of those existing connections. As I've mentioned before, we have a completely dedicated session on end-to-end networking, where we dive into these topics in more detail. But for purposes here in this demo, the main thing is you have an AVS private cloud, you have an express route connection, and that's how you get to the rest of Azure and the internet and other places. For us, we're concerned about the rest of Azure. All right, if I go back to my home screen, the next thing I want to take a look at is essentially the other side of this configuration. So I have an AVS private cloud and I have an express route circuit. Well, now what? And that's where your VNet gateway comes in. It's worth pointing out, though, that I also have to have a VNet for my VNet gateway to live in, and we're going to spend more time talking about that later. But basically, the way this works is I have this virtual network, and this virtual network gives me a space where I can connect services, in this case, including AVS, but some of the native services that we've been talking about as well. So this is my VNet, and I have a little bit of configuration I've done here where I have picked an address space, and I've also configured some subnets where I can subdivide that address space for specific purposes. And some of this we'll take a look at a little bit later. But know at least that there is, a VNet. Important for our discussion is this gateway subnet. And so the gateway subnet is where VNet gateways need to live. And a VNet gateway, specifically an express route gateway, is what we need to use for AVS to connect to the rest of Azure. So I'll jump back out here to my home screen, and let's take a look at that VNet gateway itself. So remember, this is the connection that our express route circuit uses into an AVS VNet. And one important thing here is I see the gateway type over here is express route. There's different types of gateways. We want an express route gateway. And this express route gateway lives in that subnet that we were just looking at for gateways. Once you configure a gateway, now there's some things that you need to think about when you set up your gateway. There's different SKU types, and your SKU selection is going to depend on what it is that you want to accomplish and what your use case is. And there are different capabilities that come with those different SKUs. We have a little bit more detail on that in our end-to-end networking session, and it's also well documented in our public documentation. Once you have a gateway that's set up, I've got my VNet, I've got my subnets set up. I have my VNet gateway that's an express route type. The next thing I want to do is set up a connection. And this express route connection is really what connects those items together between your AVS private cloud and the VNet gateway. And so there's some information here to be aware of. But this way looking, I know that I have a gateway connection that is part of this configuration. And now with these components, I have AVS, some workloads running inside of it. I've got an express route circuit that is connected to a VNet gateway of type express route, and I have a connection that is connecting it all together. So at this point, once I have this initial plumbing, now I have a path to communicate between the workloads in my AVS private cloud and Azure services. So let's start off talking about Azure Private Link. Azure Private Link is a service inside of Azure that allows you to connect to PaaS services and other services using a private endpoint in your virtual network, like the VNet that we were just looking at in the first demo. It provides some key benefits, including that private and secure access to services on the Azure platform. It gives you a flexible networking topology. There's a few different ways that you can configure it depending on your use case and what you're trying to accomplish. And very importantly, in the age of data and AI, and as we look at having data in AVS and extracting insights from it and potentially using Azure services, is it gives you protection against data leakage. Finally, this private connection to services is something that you can do to services running in other regions if that makes sense for your particular use case. All right, let's talk a little bit more about Azure Private Endpoints. So this is really a technology that's part of Private Link. And a private endpoint is a network interface that uses a private IP address from your VNet. And this is really the thing that allows you to make that private and secure connection to these services. Again, powered by Private Link technology. The private endpoints allow you to create connectivity from a few different places, like we were just talking about, flexible networking architecture. You can make a connection from a virtual network. That's really going to be the pattern that we focus on here today. You can use it to connect to services in regionally peered VNets, globally peered VNets. You can use it in a case where you need to make a on-premise connection over VPN or express route. And in fact, that's really the way that AVS works, is you're connecting over an express route using Private Link from, say, a workload running an AVS VM over that express route into your VNet to the private endpoint. And finally, it enables connectivity from other services that are powered by Private Link. So if you recall, all the slides that we looked at earlier with the 7 or 8 different buckets that we had at the bottom of the slide that talked about integration of services from your workload, and then we expanded those out, those were all services that are powered by Private Link. That really is the emphasis that we wanted to have for this presentation today. And it's one of the things that if you just remember a few things from this presentation, this is one of the key points, is that a private endpoint gives you private and secure access to Azure services from your AVS VMs and those workloads. And there's about 47 of those such services today. And those are what we were describing in the slides earlier. So it gives you this big palette to choose from when you're trying to do this type of integration. Okay, but we can't just stop talking about private endpoint. There's more that we need to tell you here, and that's to talk about private DNS. The DNS settings that you use to connect to Private Link are very important. And they're important because you need to pay attention to name resolution so that when you're resolving the IP address, you're resolving the private one and you're not resolving the public one. As mentioned, the private endpoint uses this private address in your VNet, but you have to get DNS working correctly and configured correctly so that can occur. So what this means, if you're connecting to the same service over a private endpoint, there are separate DNS settings and private DNS zones that are typically required. Now, there's a number of ways that you can do it, but what we really want to focus on here today are those private DNS zones. You want to be sure that your DNS settings are correct and that you're using the fully qualified domain name, the FQDN, for that connection, Again, so that it can resolve to that private IP address that's part of that private DNS zone. The network interface that's associated with the private endpoint contains the information that you'll need to configure your DNS. And this is really a couple of things. It's an FQDN and it's a private IP address endpoint. And those are things that you can plug into depending on what your use case is. There's also something called a private resolver that's helpful. And we'll take a look at all these things combined in our next demo. But what I want to do first is give you an idea of what this looks like once you have it configured. So what we're looking at here is where we have established the secure and private connection to an Azure service using Azure private endpoints and private DNS zones. And there's a couple things that we're showing here, and we want to really focus in on this name resolution pattern because it's so important. And we want to look at how it looks, say, internally from that AVS VM, for example, and what it looks like externally, and how you know when you've got it right. So we'll start off talking about the VM running in AVS. And so what this is showing here is that we're returning a private IP address for the Azure storage account. So when we create that private endpoint, it creates an FQDN like we were mentioning, and we'll talk about some DNS configuration. But what I'm seeing here basically is I have this IP address that's, when I do an NS lookup for that particular storage account, it's coming back with a private IP address. So I know I've got my private endpoint and I know I have my DNS configured correctly. For contrast, on the bottom of the screen, what we're showing here is what name resolution looks like from an external VM, one that's outside of AVS. And as you can see here, we're returning a public IP address for that Azure storage account. So we did an NS lookup for that same A record reflecting that particular storage account and how to connect to it. And on the top half from the AVS VM, we get a private IP address. On the bottom half from some VM outside of AVS, we're getting a public IP address. All right, next I want to talk a little bit about the demo environment. And we got a quick look at it in the first demo, but now in the second demo, we're going to get under the hood a little bit more. And what we've done is assembled some of the things that we've been talking about today. Is we have an AVS environment, we have a VNet that's configured. As you saw in the previous demo, we have a VNet gateway, an express route connection, so we have that all done. And then we've also set up a few additional things where we have some services that have been configured with private endpoints, as we've been discussing in this presentation. We touched on it briefly, and we'll just look at this more in the second demo. We also have a DNS private resolver to use with our private DNS zones. So we'll take a look at how that all works. We also have a jump box. There's a jump box that we're using to gain access into the environment that we can access via Bastion. This is a recommended pattern for accessing your jump boxes. All right, before we get to our demo, I do want to take a look at the DNS flow and walk you through that because it's so important to this type of configuration. So we've talked about the setup of this environment. And a couple notes here is that one, we have this DNS VM, as I was discussing before. We have some DNS both in Azure VMware Solution and some DNS that's living in Azure. And we're going to talk about how this flow works. And so ultimately what we're saying is, I think in this scenario, we'll say it's a database expansion scenario like you have for maybe SQL MI use case like we talked about, and as we're showing on the diagram here. And that web app basically needs to get the address of the SQL MI instance to establish a connection, but it wants that private IP address to make the secure and private connection. So let's walk through this flow. We basically start off with the web app VM. It's configured to resolve DNS from its local DNS virtual machine. That DNS virtual machine will realize it will be configured with a conditional forwarder for the zone that contains the SQL MI record. So it says, oh, I know where to send those requests. It's off to this private resolver, the endpoint of the private resolver. The private resolver then using Azure Platform DNS recognizes that's part of a private DNS zone, which we will have configured. And that private DNS zone contains some of these A records, including in this case, the one for SQL MI that the web app VM is trying to resolve in the first place. So basically the next step here is the private DNS will return a result to the DNS VM requesting that address. And then finally, it'll return the private address coming out of the private DNS zone for that SQL MI endpoint. Now that we've walked through the DNS flow, it's time for another demo. And let's take a look at how this is configured from the Azure portal. So we'll switch back over into the portal again. So I think we'll start off by looking at a private endpoint. We've talked about it a lot, but what does it actually look like? So I've created a few here. I'll walk through some creation process so you can see what it looks like. And then I'll show you some pre-configured ones that we're going to use in the rest of our demo. Here I've got a subscription. I need to select a resource group for this to go in. I have separated out resource groups to represent the function, in this case, network. And usually when I'm doing this, I like to name something that represents the resource that it actually is. And as you can see, I already have one like this. So just for the purposes of getting through this wizard, we'll give it a little more information so we can advance to the next screen. But I need to give it a name like any other resource inside of Azure. And remember, we were talking about there's a network interface that gets the private IP address. Here's where you can see that. My resources are currently in West US 2, so I'll stick there. And next, you need to define a resource type. Right? This is an important selection because the private endpoint is dedicated to the particular service that you're using. All right, so I'll go ahead and stick with the blob. Oh, it's actually called storage. There we go. So I have a storage account, and that's my resource type. And then notice there is a resource underneath that. Remember, we talked about private link. So we have these different private link, resources and services that are integrated with powered by private link. And so now I can make a selection here. I didn't go through this configuration, but what I'm showing here is these are different storage accounts that I had pre-configured in this environment. There's one called AVS ML demo. And once I select a resource, then I can select a sub-resource. In this case, there's lots of different types of storage. So we'll say in my case, I'm going for just the regular blob, and this is what it would look like. And you would select the resource type that's appropriate for the resource that you're using. And going back to that slide where we had a lot of service names, those more or less are those services that we were talking about, the 47 or so private link enabled services. All right, because I have this network interface, I need to put somewhere, and that's what this page is about with our VNet. I'm going to select I have a dedicated VNet for this particular environment, and I have some different subnets here. I've carved out one just for private endpoint. That's one of the subnets I created in my VNet earlier. So I could select that here. And for the private IP configuration, I'll leave this as dynamically allocated. All right, and then taking a look at the private DNS side of it is, remember I was mentioning the importance of DNS, and we walked through the DNS flow, and there was some integration. Here's that private DNS integration that I was discussing. So by default, you can see that yes is selected here, and that will help us with the zone creation, as well as some of the records inside of the zone that we can look at, in a second. I need to pick a place for that to go. I have a resource group dedicated to networking. I could put it somewhere else if I wanted to. But based on my earlier selections, this is where it would go. And this is basically saying, like, I'm going to create this private DNS zone with this configuration name in this location. And then tags and review and create. I'm just going to skip the creation process for purposes of the demo. I created one of these earlier, and we'll take a look at one of them. So here's one pretty similar to the process I just walked through. We have a VNet subnet. I've got this private endpoint, and there's a network interface, and that network interface lives in that subnet. And I can go look here. Here's the private IP address. So remember when we were doing name resolution and talking about resolving the private IP address, here is the private IP address for this network interface associated with the private endpoint. All right, now there's more to look at because remember, it had a private DNS zone integration. So let's go ahead and look at that. We were just doing blob, so we'll stick with the theme. These are different private DNS zones, by the way. And in fact, all of these have been created by that private endpoint, private DNS integration that we were just looking at a few moments ago. If I click on private link, .blob.core.windows.net, this is where records would have gone had I gone through with that creation wizard we were looking at and where the one I actually created lives. And if I scroll down a little bit here, it might be difficult to see at the bottom, but really the point is I've got some records here, some A records in DNS in this private DNS zone. So that flow that we were walking through, here's the private DNS side of it. All right, one more thing we need to talk about on the Azure side, and then we can jump inside of AVS and take a look at that DNS configuration as well. And that is a private DNS resolver. I just have one of those. And the important thing to notice here is the inbound endpoint. In other words, where am I accepting DNS requests for this private resolver? So we'll click on that, and that will take me to my inbound endpoint. And I have an endpoint name here called DNS forwarder and an IP address 10.10.54. So the importance of this is the location where I can send, as it describes on the top here, where name resolution requests can go. So this is the address I need to send to. In other words, this is the address I need to configure when I'm doing conditional forwarding from wherever my DNS might live that ultimately my AVS workloads are using. All right, so let's take a look at that real quick to wrap up our demo. And we can see that here. Apologies if that's a little difficult to see. But what I would point out here is there's a number of conditional forwarders, and we'll stick with our blob story. Is I have a zone here, private link.blob.core.windows.net. That matches the zone, the private DNS zone name that we were just looking at. And here is the address that it's configured for to do conditional forwarding for that zone, 10.10.5.4, which is the inbound endpoint that we were just looking at. So this is really how the DNS side configuration looks. And then the final thing to show here is I can resolve addresses. And there's a number of them that we've been discussing. Here's one for file instead of blob. So I'm already in NS lookup, and I'm asking it, hey, give me back the address. And you can see here that this is a private address, 10.10.3.5. So this is the importance of using, as described earlier, this FQDN when you're configuring whatever client request, like in our slides, we had a web app, whatever this workload is that lives here, should be using this name for resolution. So it will go through that flow and resolve to that private address to give you secure and private access. All right, that's it for this demo. So next, we'll take a closer look at one more use case, and that is turning data into business insights. As I mentioned earlier, it'd be difficult to have this session today without talking a little bit more about Azure machine learning and AI. And specifically, what I want to talk about is one of the services that we discussed in earlier slides that you can integrate with your AVS VM workloads, which is Azure Machine Learning. It's an ML platform that allows data scientists to build models and extend enterprise applications, and to do so quickly, reliably, and safely. And this is our customer promise to you, that we give you the tools that will allow you to accelerate an end-to-end machine learning lifecycle in a safe manner. So if we talk about the Azure Machine Learning platform, there's a few things that we need to consider. And the process of turning data into business insights involves a number of steps. initially you need to ingest and prepare data. And Azure Machine Learning allows you to use things like structured data and unstructured data. And some of that structured data could live in places like AVS, perhaps a SQL database that's on one of your AVS VMs. So we need ways to ingest and prepare that data. And really what Azure Machine Learning will help you do is to prepare that data, build and train models, deploy those models into production, manage and monitor them, and improve and iterate over time, along with some governance capabilities and analytics to tell you how they're performing. This is a little bit closer look at the previous slide of the components of the Azure Machine Learning platform. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time to get into every single detail of the platform today. So what I really want to emphasize is really two things. Is one, you may have data existing in AVS in your workloads already that you want to turn into insights. I want to focus on this middle part around comprehensive ML ops. And really that is like the flow of how we take data out of one environment and get it into Azure Machine Learning to obtain those insights about our data. So this is what we see amongst our customers. This is enterprise machine learning and a lifecycle that we see in the real world, where basically there is a business need that is identified, and you have a hypothesis and you gather and prep data, right? Again, that data could live inside of AVS somewhere. And you determine whether or not it's valuable to proceed, and then you can move forward with advancing the project, operationalization, retraining, and then making iterations, or perhaps even reverting the project if at some point we realize that it's not going the way that we do. Now, the emphasis here is not to break down every single one of these steps because we don't have time to do that today, but certainly your account team can assist you with that. But it's really to say that there's a flow. There's this flow of data inside a machine learning lifecycle that needs to happen that Azure ML helps facilitate. There's really deployment patterns across any infrastructure, and you can see some of those here. And what I want to emphasize today is that when you have AVS in close proximity to Azure, having AVS in Azure itself gives you many of these integration capabilities that we talked about in some of the earlier slides, that collection of services kind of surrounding the private cloud. By having AVS in Azure, it also only gives you that capability, but it gives you these extension capabilities where you can integrate into native services and do more with them. And there's a great reason to do that, and we've been emphasizing that point today. Some of that is it gives you more security and control. It gives you this basically private machine learning environment or private IP configuration through private endpoint that allows you to prevent data exfiltration by policy. And the way you can realize that, like in our particular example, is you have an AVS private cloud. It's connected to a VNet, like we've discussed already today. You have private endpoints, like we've been discussing in that same VNet, that allow you to communicate securely to Azure Machine Learning workspaces to do some of those tasks that we were looking at on a previous slide. So that's really the one that we're highlighting today, highlighted in green in this table here, is this use case. In the compute, when it says bring your own compute, that can be AVS, and that's what we're describing in this case. And we want to take a little closer look at what that might look like if you're trying to do this with your AVS workloads. This is really a summary slide. It's a network isolation architecture. And like some of the services that we've been talking about, Azure Machine Learning has integration so that it can use private endpoints powered by private link, as we've been discussing. So you can have private workspace and private associated resources access via those endpoints. And so that way, you're training your models privately without access to the internet required. There's no public IPs. And you can also do some private model scoring. So this is a pattern that we see, and this is all extended by the things that we've been looking at today. If you look at the bottom of the slide, we have an AVS private cloud. There's an express route connection. It lives inside of that VNet. Once we live inside of that VNet, we can start doing these things that you see described in this slide. The story wouldn't be complete, though, with talking a little bit about how we move data. And that's what Azure Data Factory is about. Again, my purpose here today is really just to give you an introduction and let you know that we have tools that can facilitate some of this movement of data from one place to another for these particular patterns. And what I want to emphasize is you don't need to change your existing applications to do any of this. And in fact, moving data, as we saw in the earlier workflows, is really one of these necessary parts of building models and deploying them to production. So Azure Data Factory gives you a simplified way to move data around your environment in a secure fashion. And like Azure Machine Learning, Azure Data Factory also supports private endpoints, so you can take advantage of the secure and private model that we've been talking about. Here's a quick overview of what Azure Data Factory looks like. And there's really just 2 points I want to emphasize here is your data sources can be many different things. It can be on-premise data, it can be cloud data, it can be SaaS data. So the purpose of how AVS works really, it can work in a similar pattern to how on-premise data sources work, where if I have a SQL database running in a VM on-premise, I can use Azure Data Factory to extract that data. That same pattern really works in AVS, but by being in AVS, because it's Azure, you get some added benefits. So you can use ADF to get your data out of its location and into something like Azure ML, shown in the center. So we see these things working together for our AVS customers looking to extract business insights from their data. And last, what I want to leave you with is ADF is a very powerful platform that allows you to connect to all your enterprise data. There's over 100 built-in connectors that will allow you to realize this pattern that we were just discussing. So if some of these logos look familiar and you migrate these workloads into AVS, what I'm saying is that you have a way using Azure Data Factory to get the data out of there and into some other service, perhaps Azure Machine Learning, to gain those insights and accelerate innovation in your organization. So with that, I'd like to move on to our final demo, and we'll take a look at what this looks like when we put it all together. All right, so where I want to start off with is looking at the Azure Machine Learning Studio. And this is what I can connect to do some work. But before I get too far, let's take a look at a SQL server that I've deployed. So I'm using one of our sample data sets called Worldwide Importers, available on GitHub. And there's 2 databases here. There is one for OLTP and another for OLAP. And I'm looking at a transactions table here. And let's say, for example, I want to try to use Azure Machine Learning so that I can gain some insights, from this data. So this is an AVS VM running inside of my AVS private cloud. And I've just done a little query here to show some of the data. Now, the first step, if I want to move data, there's ways I can do it. There's the manual way. So I can use some of the tools in SQL Management Studio to do an export. And I've already done that here just for the sake of time. I went and I exported a CSV file that contained the contents of this table that I was looking at inside of Management Studio. And I'm doing that so I have a flat file so that I can basically transport around and use inside of Azure Machine Learning. If you look here, there's something important to realize. There is a connection. I have mapped a drive to this file, Azure file endpoint that is actually a private endpoint. It doesn't have that in the URL, but it is a private endpoint. Actually, if I just go here, I can do a lookup to demonstrate that it essentially resolves that private link. So I have a private IP address here, and I have mapped from the SQL server a drive to that Azure file location so that I can securely and privately, share this flat file, which is a dump of this database table. Okay, so once I've done that, now I will fully acknowledge this is not something you would necessarily do at scale. I just wanted to show one pattern and how we start assembling these things together. If I'm doing this on a continuous basis, that's something like where Azure Data Factory would come in. All right, once I have it in this location, there's only really a couple more steps I need to do to start leveraging it. So back over to my Machine Learning Studio. If I go over to data on the left-hand side here, I've created a couple already. We'll just walk through what it looks like so you can see the process. It's tabular data. This is a flat file. That's fine. I'll just give it a sample name for purposes of the demo. It's in Azure storage, right? Because this is Azure Files. And I happen to know from what I was doing before that, well, it's not blob storage, it's file share. It's the workspace file store next. And if I click into this folder, here it is. So this is all I need to do to use that data. I map the drive, I export the data, I copy the data into that map share, that file share, and now it's accessible to me in Azure ML securely and privately. So I went ahead and did that earlier. And then the next thing I want to do is say, like, hey, is there something I can learn by using that data? And how can I get an insight by using it? And so that's where like a job comes in, is you can set up a job. Now, what I'll walk through actually first is automated ML. If you're new to machine learning, we don't have time to get through all of it today. So automated ML, auto ML can be a good starting point. And I can create a new auto ML job. I have to give it a job name, and I can make it an existing experiment if I want to. I'm going to create new here just so I can advance. Sample. Here's where you can see this would be the one I had pre-created, but this is my data source that I exported. I need to give it a task type. And we'll say, since this is transactions, maybe I want to try to predict something about transactions using a regression model. What am I trying to predict exactly? That's a good question. Let's see, what can we tell? Maybe stock item ID. Do we think that we could predict a stock item ID, like what people are going to order based on some of these other things? Maybe that's our experiment we want to look at. I need a compute cluster. I went ahead and created a couple of different sizes. We'll say train cluster. Next, and submit training job. So that's actually all it takes, right? And now this is going to start training and building and assessing my first machine learning model. And it takes a little while to run. So there's one that I ran earlier. And this completed a little bit earlier today. And if I look here, I have a number of child jobs that all ran for different lengths of time, as you can see. And these produce different results, right? It's all about trying to find the most effective model. But I didn't do anything more than what I just showed you. It ran for an hour and a half. I have some metrics here that it spit out. And then if I want to, there's more data here inside of these tags that give me information about each individual run. So what we've showed basically is how you can take data, say from a SQL server running in an AVS VM, move it over securely and privately to a location where Azure ML could then use AutoML to start determining whether or not it can gain some insights from that data. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your time today. And thank you for listening to what I had to share about integrating with Azure services. I truly hope that this has inspired you to think about how you might leverage more Azure services to innovate with your workloads in AVS, and perhaps even gain some insights from the data that you already have there. If these topics were of interest to you and you want to learn more, especially about AI and ML, please reach out to your account teams and we'd be happy to help you learn more. Thanks again for your time today.